The Vietnam War. Even the name evokes powerful images: a jungle landscape, helicopters roaring overhead, and the faces of young soldiers forever etched in our collective memory. The Vietnam War, lasting from 1954 to 1975, was a conflict like no other. It was a war that divided a nation, both literally and figuratively. It was a war that pitted superpower against smaller nation, ideology against ideology. The Vietnam War left an indelible mark on history. It shaped the political landscape of the late 20th century. It forced the United States to confront its role in the world, and it left behind a legacy of pain, loss, and unanswered questions. This is the story of that war. A story of courage and sacrifice, of division and disillusionment, and ultimately a story of the human cost of conflict. The Vietnam War was a complex and multifaceted conflict. To understand it, we must delve into its roots, its key players, and the forces that drove it. We must journey back in time to the jungles of Southeast Asia, where the fate of nations hung in the balance. Join us as we explore the history of the Vietnam War, a conflict that reshaped the world. To understand the Vietnam War, we must first understand Vietnam itself. Located in Southeast Asia, Vietnam boasts a rich history and culture. However, by the mid-20th century, Vietnam was a nation divided. The Geneva Accords of 1954, following the defeat of the French colonial power, had temporarily partitioned the country into North and South Vietnam. The North, led by Ho Chi Minh and the Communist Viet Minh, sought to reunify the country under a single communist regime. The South, supported by the United States, aimed to establish an independent democratic state. This division, drawn along ideological lines, set the stage for one of the most protracted and brutal conflicts of the Cold War. The Cold War, a global struggle between the capitalist West, led by the United States, and the Communist bloc, spearheaded by the Soviet Union, provided the broader context for the Vietnam War. Both superpowers, locked in a battle for global dominance, saw Vietnam as a strategic pawn in their ideological struggle. The United States, fearing the domino theory, the idea that the fall of one Southeast Asian nation to communism would lead to the fall of others, committed itself to preventing the communist takeover of South Vietnam. This commitment, initially through financial aid and military advisors, would escalate into direct military intervention, drawing the United States deeper into the quagmire of the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War was not just a local conflict, it was a global drama, with a cast of characters that spanned continents. On one side stood North Vietnam, a determined communist state backed by its powerful allies, the Soviet Union and China. On the other side stood South Vietnam, struggling to establish itself as an independent nation, propped up by the United States and its allies. The United States, driven by Cold War anxieties and a belief in the containment of communism, played a pivotal role in the conflict. Its military might and economic resources made it a formidable force in support of South Vietnam. However, the United States' involvement in Vietnam would prove to be deeply divisive, both at home and abroad. The Soviet Union and China, eager to expand their sphere of influence and support their communist brethren in North Vietnam, provided military aid, training, and logistical support. Their involvement, while less direct than that of the United States, significantly shaped the course of the war. The Vietnam War was not only a clash of ideologies, but also a clash of cultures. The United States, with its modern military technology and unfamiliar terrain, often found itself at odds with the Vietnamese people and their way of life. This cultural disconnect, coupled with the brutality of the war, fueled anti-war sentiment in the United States and around the world. The Vietnam War did not erupt from a vacuum. It was, in many ways, a continuation of a decades-long struggle for Vietnamese independence and a tragic echo of colonial pasts. To understand the roots of the conflict, we must travel back to the late 19th century when Vietnam fell under French colonial rule, becoming part of French Indochina. French colonial rule was marked by exploitation and oppression. The French sought to extract resources from Vietnam, prioritizing their own economic interests over the welfare of the Vietnamese people. This exploitation fueled resentment among the Vietnamese, sowing the seeds of resistance. resistance to French rule took various forms, from peaceful protests to armed uprisings. One of the key figures to emerge from this resistance movement was Ho Chi Minh. A young revolutionary, deeply influenced by communist ideology, Ho Chi Minh would become a pivotal figure in Vietnam's fight for independence. In 1941, Ho Chi Minh founded the Viet Minh, a communist-led nationalist movement dedicated to liberating Vietnam from foreign rule. The Viet Minh gained widespread support among the Vietnamese peasantry, who saw them as champions of independence and social justice. Section 2. The rise of Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh. Ho Chi Minh, a figure both revered and demonized, was a complex and charismatic leader. Born Nguyen Sin Cung in 1890, he adopted the nom de guerre Ho Chi Minh, meaning he who enlightens, reflecting his unwavering belief in a brighter future for Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh's ideology was a blend of nationalism and communism. He saw colonialism as a form of capitalist exploitation and believed that communism offered a path to both national liberation and social equality. Under his leadership, the Viet Minh waged a guerrilla war against the Japanese during World War II, further solidifying their standing among the Vietnamese people. Following Japan's surrender in 1945, Ho Chi Minh declared Vietnam's independence, echoing the words of the American Declaration of Independence. However, France, unwilling to relinquish its colonial grip, returned to Vietnam, seeking to reassert its authority. This marked the beginning of the First Indochina War, a bloody 8-year conflict that would pit the Viet Minh against the French. The First Indochina War was a turning point in Vietnamese history. The Viet Minh, despite being outgunned and outmanned, fought valiantly against the French, utilizing guerrilla tactics and exploiting the dense jungle terrain to their advantage. Section 3. Seeds of Division, the Geneva Accords. The pivotal moment in the First Indochina War came in 1954 with the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. The Viet Minh, under General Vo Nguyen Giap, achieved a stunning victory, ending France's colonial presence in Vietnam. The defeat forced France to the negotiating table. In July 1954, the Geneva Accords were signed, ending the First Indochina War. Vietnam was temporarily divided along the 17th parallel. Nationwide elections were planned for 1956 to reunify the country. However, the accords sowed the seeds of future conflict. Section 4. Diem's South, a nation divided against itself. With the Geneva Accords in place, Vietnam found itself divided, a nation cleaved in two. In the north, Ho Chi Minh and the communist Viet Minh consolidated their power, embarking on a program of land redistribution and socialist reforms. In the south, a new government emerged under the leadership of Ngo Dinh Diem, a staunchly anti-communist nationalist. Diem, backed by the United States, sought to build a viable, non-communist state in South Vietnam. However, his rule was plagued by problems from the outset. Diem, a Catholic in a predominantly Buddhist country, faced accusations of religious persecution. His government was widely seen as corrupt and authoritarian, alienating many segments of South Vietnamese society. Moreover, Diem faced growing opposition from the Viet Cong, a communist-led guerrilla movement in the south, supported by the North Vietnamese government. The Viet Cong, exploiting the grievances of the South Vietnamese peasantry and Diem's unpopularity, launched a campaign of sabotage and assassination aiming to destabilize the South Vietnamese government. Diem's rule became increasingly repressive as he sought to crush dissent and consolidate his power. He imprisoned thousands of suspected communists and political opponents, further fueling the flames of discontent in South Vietnam. By the early 1960s, South Vietnam teetered on the brink of collapse, its government weakened by internal divisions and facing a growing communist insurgency. Section 5. The Specter of Communism, the Domino Theory and U.S. Involvement. The United States, committed to containing communism, viewed Vietnam with growing alarm. The domino theory argued that the fall of one Southeast Asian nation to communism would lead to the fall of others. Under President Eisenhower, the U.S. began providing aid to South Vietnam. Initially modest, this aid focused on training and equipping the South Vietnamese army. As the situation deteriorated, U.S. involvement escalated. President Kennedy increased U.S. military advisors and authorized defoliants like Agent Orange. This involvement would prove deeply divisive and lead to a costly war. Section 1. Escalation from advisors to combat troops. The early 1960s saw a steady increase in American military advisors in South Vietnam, a number that grew from a few hundred to several thousand. These advisors, initially tasked with training and supporting the South Vietnamese army, found themselves increasingly drawn into combat roles as the Viet Cong insurgency gained momentum. The Kennedy administration, though reluctant to commit large-scale U.S. combat troops, found itself trapped in a deepening quagmire. The situation in South Vietnam continued to deteriorate, with the Viet Cong controlling vast swaths of the countryside and launching increasingly daring attacks on South Vietnamese government installations. In November 1963, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas, leaving his successor, Lyndon B. Johnson, to grapple with the escalating crisis in Vietnam. Johnson, a staunch Cold Warrior, believed that American credibility was at stake in Vietnam and that the United States could not afford to allow South Vietnam to fall to communism. The Gulf of Tonkin incident in August 1964 provided Johnson with the pretext he needed to escalate U.S. involvement in Vietnam. The incident, involving alleged attacks on U.S. Navy destroyers by North Vietnamese torpedo boats, remains shrouded in controversy to this day. Nevertheless, Johnson seized on the incident to push through the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, granting him broad war powers to combat communist aggression in Vietnam. The Gulf of Tonkin incident and the Tonkin Gulf Resolution. On August 2, 1964, the USS Maddox reported being attacked by North Vietnamese torpedo boats. A second attack was reported 2 days later, though its veracity was questioned. The Johnson administration used the incident to escalate U.S. involvement in Vietnam. Johnson addressed the nation, portraying the attacks as unprovoked aggression. The Tonkin Gulf Resolution, passed on August 7, 1964, authorized all necessary measures to repel attacks. This resolution marked a turning point, leading to massive U.S. military escalation in Vietnam. Section 3. Americanization of the war operation Rolling Thunder and the ground war intensifies. With the Tonkin Gulf Resolution in hand, the Johnson administration unleashed a massive bombing campaign against North Vietnam, codenamed Operation Rolling Thunder. The operation, intended to cripple North Vietnam's war-making capacity and force Hanoi to the negotiating table, would last for 3 long years. American ground troops, initially deployed in limited numbers, began arriving in Vietnam in large numbers. By 1965, over 180,000 U.S. combat troops were fighting in Vietnam, a number that would swell to over 500,000 by 1968. The nature of the war in Vietnam, a guerrilla conflict fought in dense jungles and rice paddies, proved to be a nightmare for the American military. The Viet Cong, masters of camouflage and ambush tactics, blended seamlessly into the civilian population, making it difficult for U.S. forces to distinguish friend from foe. The American military, relying on superior firepower and technology, found itself bogged down in a war of attrition. Search and destroy missions designed to root out Viet Cong guerrillas often resulted in heavy civilian casualties, alienating the local population and fueling anti-war sentiment. Section 4. The Tet Offensive, a turning point. The Tet Offensive, launched in January 1968, shattered the illusion of U.S. victory, deeply impacting American public opinion and intensifying anti-war protests. Section 5. The war drags on. Attrition and Vietnamization. Nixon's Vietnamization policy aimed to withdraw U.S. troops while building up the South Vietnamese army, but the war's expansion into Cambodia sparked nationwide protests. After years of negotiations, the Paris Peace Accords were signed in January 1973, marking a formal end to U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War. However, fighting continued, and in April 1975, North Vietnamese forces captured Saigon, ending the war. The Vietnam War was not only fought on the battlefields of Southeast Asia, it was also fought on the streets of America. Anti-war protests grew, driven by moral outrage, opposition to the draft, and skepticism about the government's justifications for the war. President John F. Kennedy inherited the Vietnam conflict in 1961. Determined to prevent the loss of Vietnam to communism, Kennedy increased U.S. military advisors in South Vietnam. These advisors found themselves increasingly drawn into combat. The use of defoliants like Agent Orange had devastating consequences. Despite his commitment, Kennedy grappled with the implications of deeper U.S. involvement. Following Kennedy's assassination in 1963, Lyndon B. Johnson assumed the presidency. Johnson escalated U.S. involvement, transforming the conflict into a full-blown American war by 1968. Richard Nixon campaigned for the presidency in 1968, promising to end the Vietnam War and bring peace with honor. Nixon's Vietnamization policy aimed to withdraw U.S. troops while strengthening the South Vietnamese army. But secret bombings fueled anti-war sentiment. As the Vietnam War escalated, so did opposition within the United States. The anti-war movement, fueled by moral outrage and opposition to the draft, utilized various tactics to make their voices heard. Section 5. The media's lens. Vietnam on television and the rise of public dissent. The Vietnam War was the first televised war, and the images broadcast into American living rooms played a crucial role in shaping public perceptions and fueling dissent. Section 6. The faces of dissent, from college campuses to the streets of America. The anti-war movement was a diverse coalition, including students, civil rights organizations, religious groups, and veterans, all united in their opposition to the war. Section 1. Scars on the landscape. The devastation of Vietnam. The Vietnam War left a lasting impact on Vietnam, with millions of civilians killed or wounded, and the use of Agent Orange causing long-term environmental and health consequences. Section 2. A generation divided. The war's impact on American society. The Vietnam War had a profound and lasting impact on American society, dividing the nation, eroding trust in government, and leaving behind a generation scarred by the experience. The war became a defining event for a generation of Americans, shaping their political views, their social consciousness, and their outlook on the world. Over 58,000 American soldiers died in Vietnam, and hundreds of thousands more returned home wounded, both physically and psychologically. Many Vietnam veterans faced a difficult homecoming, greeted with indifference, hostility, or a lack of understanding from a public weary of war and divided over its legacy. The war also took a toll on the families of those who served, leaving behind grieving parents, spouses, and children. The war's impact on American families was often hidden from view, but the pain and loss were no less real. The Vietnam War also fueled social and political divisions within the United States. The anti-war movement, while instrumental in raising awareness of the war's horrors, also polarized American society, pitting those who supported the war against those who opposed it. These divisions, often bitter and personal, continued long after the war ended, shaping the political landscape for decades to come. Section 3. The ripple effect, global consequences of the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War had far-reaching global consequences, shaping the Cold War and international relations. The war's impact on Cambodia was devastating. U.S. bombings destabilized Cambodia, leading to the rise of the Khmer Rouge. Laos, a neutral country, was also profoundly affected. U.S. bombings left a legacy of unexploded ordnance in Laos. The war strained U.S. relations with its allies. Many allies viewed it as a costly and unwinnable conflict. The Vietnam War, A conflict that claimed millions of lives continues to cast a long shadow over international relations. The war's legacy is complex and contested, a source of both reflection and debate. One enduring legacy is the importance of public support for military interventions. The war showed that even a superpower cannot sustain a costly conflict without public backing. Media coverage and anti-war protests eroded public support, forcing the U.S. to withdraw. The war highlighted the limitations of military force in achieving political objectives. Despite military superiority, the U.S. could not defeat a determined enemy on its own terrain. The war demonstrated that military victory does not necessarily equate to political success. The Vietnam War offers valuable lessons for the future, reminding us of the human cost of conflict and the importance of diplomacy. The Vietnam War, though officially concluded with the fall of Saigon in 1975, continues to cast a long shadow. The scars of war, both visible and invisible, run deep, a reminder of the enduring human cost of conflict. For Vietnam, the war left behind a legacy of physical devastation, social upheaval, and the lingering trauma of a generation scarred by violence and loss. The Vietnamese people, known for their resilience and determination, have made remarkable strides in rebuilding their country from the ashes of war. However, the legacy of Agent Orange, the countless unexploded ordnance littering the countryside, and the enduring health and environmental consequences of the conflict continue to pose significant challenges. The war's psychological toll is equally profound. Many Vietnamese families were torn apart by the conflict, separated by ideology, displacement, or the loss of loved ones. The trauma of war, passed down through generations, continues to shape the lives of many Vietnamese. Reconciliation and healing remain a long and arduous process. The United States, too, continues to grapple with the legacy of the Vietnam War. The war divided the nation, eroded trust in government, and left behind a generation of veterans haunted by their experiences. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. stands as a solemn reminder of the war's human cost, a place of remembrance and reflection for a nation still coming to terms with its past. Despite the profound challenges posed by the war's legacy, Vietnam has emerged as a nation transformed. The Vietnamese people, demonstrating remarkable resilience and determination, have rebuilt their country from the ruins, embracing economic reforms and rejoining the global community. Following the war, Vietnam faced a period of economic hardship and isolation. The country's infrastructure lay in ruins, its economy shattered. The communist government's initial attempts at centralized planning proved largely ineffective, leading to widespread poverty and stagnation. However, in the mid-1980s, Vietnam embarked on a series of economic reforms known as Doi Moi, which introduced market-oriented policies and opened up the country to foreign investment. These reforms, coupled with Vietnam's youthful population and entrepreneurial spirit, have led to remarkable economic growth and development. Today, Vietnam is one of the fastest-growing economies in the world, a hub for manufacturing, tourism, and technology. The country has made significant strides in reducing poverty, improving healthcare, and expanding access to education. Vietnam's journey from the ashes of war to economic powerhouse stands as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. The Vietnam War, though a product of its time, continues to hold profound relevance for the 21st century. The war's lessons offer valuable insights into conflict, military power, and diplomacy. It serves as a stark reminder of the human cost of conflict. The Vietnam War underscores the importance of critical thinking and questioning authority. It offers a message of hope and resilience, reminding us of the human capacity for renewal.